Hello, everyone. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Hi, Patty. How are you?
I am fine. How are you doing this afternoon?
Pretty good, thanks. Can't complain at all. So I would like to say that if we've had some new subscribers lately on YouTube and also some on Rumble, so I wish to thank everyone who's a new subscriber. If you're not already, please consider clicking the subscribe button, which should be right down here. Little confusion about that last time. We have our Facebook groups, and links for everything will be down below. We have email address, again, paranormalist at theparanormalistpodcast.com. Be happy to hear from you. And with that, I think it's back to you.
Well, today I wanted to talk about what is under the ground. So I was doing some reading and I came across these really interesting stories of beings and things monsters, things that are under the ground. So I started doing a little research. As you know, I was working on the book on reptoids, and so I was doing research on that, came across this other stuff that was really interesting and put it over for a podcast. And this weekend seemed to be the weekend I wanted to work on that. So every culture has stories of beings from the underground realm, whether they're benign, learned masters, demonic, whatever they are. But almost every culture in the world has something. And so I started coming across these stories the other day. And just so everybody knows, I don't like plan the podcast months in advance. I pick a whole bunch of subjects that get interesting to me and I chuck them into my folder, and eventually they just kind of fall out in the way they're meant to. So I wish I could tell you I was exceedingly organized, but it's not the truth. So this is the one that fell out and really caught my attention. So all across the world, there are these amazing stories ranging all the way back from early times to today. And I wanted to share some of them. So we're going to start with some tunnels and train tunnels and tube tunnels for the underground subways, things of that nature, and then move our way from that to some other bizarre beings that apparently live under the ground, under our feet. So the first one I wanted to visit was from the United States. It's from South Carolina, and there are service tunnels under the University of South Carolina. Now, these tunnels were built in the 1800s, and, you know, like anything of that nature, they're damp and dark and creaky, and people make up ghost stories about them, whether they're true or not. But it's not the ghost stories that are of interest to me today. It's the sightings of this bizarre creature that has been seen down there. Now, the first known sighting was 1949, November of 1949. A student at the university, Christopher Nichols, was walking along the street, on the street above, and there's a place at the time was called the Long Street Theater, when he saw what he would describe as a figure wearing a silver suit, who crossed the street in front of him, opened a manhole cover, and disappeared into the tunnels down below. Well, again, look at the time frame, 1949. We weren't talking a lot about, you know, aliens walking around college towns and stuff in that time frame. So he was really startled. It made the local school paper, and they dubbed this guy the Sewer Man. But that's going to change really quick. So in April of 1950, a police officer was in the same area, and he's patrolling. He's not thinking about Sewer Man. You know, he's just doing his job. And he comes across a pile of discarded feathers and remains. He gets out of the car to take a look at what this is. It's a massive bloody something. It turns out it's chicken parts. They're all bloody and wet, so they haven't been there very long. It looks like they were mauled or mutilated by an animal, and there was multiple chickens. So he runs his flashlight around the scene. It's dark out, and he's trying to see what animal might have, you know, brought them here, and is it still there? Because if it could do this to the chickens, it could hurt people.
Right.
And that's when he sees what he would describe as the distance a hunched over figure decked out in a silver suit. It was kind of in the shadows at the edge of a building, and it had what he called gray skin and a grotesque appearance. They don't go into any more detail than that. But the one thing that really rattled the police officer is that whenever his light caught it, it stood up, turned, and faced him, and it had 3 eyes. It had a third eye in the middle of its head, whatever it was.
Bizarre.
And yeah, it is bizarre. I mean, and this is something that you would think would be like kids drinking too much, you know, kind of a story, except for the fact that it was a police officer who reports it. And as soon as this thing is in the light and it looks at him, it realizes it's been seen. It kind of scowls as though it's frustrated or upset. And then it ran down the street a little ways, lifted open one of the manhole covers and dropped into the tunnel system below, which runs under that section of the town. And the policeman followed after it, but he couldn't find anything, and he wasn't going down in that hole by himself, and I can't say that I blame him at all. So it was at this point that it makes the newspaper again, and now they call him the Third Eye Man because of the third eye, you know, the police officer reported. Now, this continues off and on through the 1970s. You can imagine, you know, rattled people seeing this figure, usually along that street. And it got to the point where like college kids would dare each other and get bravado and, you know, we'll go down in there, but they don't really, they get frightened. And on several occasions they did see a figure. People did see this figure. Curiosity seekers, you know, came. People talked about it being everything from a deranged psychopath to a homeless guy to a monster from the deep. So there really was nothing that anybody came up with to explain it. The police did eventually go through the tunnels and look. They went down several times and searched the tunnels. They found considerable little piles of bones indicating that whatever this was, or something anyhow, had brought small animals, birds, small farm animals, pets down there and had mutilated and eaten them, whatever this thing was. So this story has gone on off and on all the way through the 1970s, and there are people who claim there have been a few unverified sightings more recently. And if you move over to Phantoms and Monsters, which is a site owned by a gentleman named Lon Strickler, he gets some amazing information, and he tells a story that kind of is reminiscent of this. So he talks about a guy who had been down in the caves in the same area, and he said he had spotted an entrance to the old mine on the west side of the street. He said it looked like it was in good shape. And even though it was blocked off and he was told that, you know, you shouldn't go over into that section, it was marked off as a dangerous area, he decided to go check it out because he had heard the stories, and you know how that goes. Sometimes you get too curious. As he enters it, he realizes it looks like it's in really good shape inside. It's safe to walk in, or at least he estimates it's safe. And he begins to walk through this area down towards where the mine connects to the tunnels that go under the school. And he's got about a mile, he estimates, into this tunnel area when he sees that it breaks into the mine shaft, and that's where the two joins. And he says he goes about 100 yards beyond that, where the tunnel and the mine shaft had connected. And that's when he said the most insane thing. He said people came bleeding out of the walls. Like they literally just came out, oozed through the wall. And they had black uniforms on, and they took him. They captured him. They took him to Mesa, Arizona. This was North Carolina, where they kept him for 72 hours. They questioned him and found out that his home was in Colorado, and he had been visiting the area, had heard the stories, and had decided to explore. They gave him a plane ticket to Denver, Colorado, and told him to never come back to the area ever again. And he was told not to speak about what had happened ever.
So these were humans then. I mean, that the humans. So it's not. I mean, you've told stories before about reptilians that
Right.
kind of materialized out of the wall. But this is that's interesting that they're human.
They appeared
Yeah.
human to him. He thought they were human. Um, they, from what he said, there was one of them that kind of was like a handler to him that kind of escorted him where he was going and explained to him how important it was that he not tell the story. He didn't tell the story for quite a long time, but eventually years went by and he felt like there might be something going on that, with the government making deals with aliens or extraterrestrials or underground beings or whatever. And eventually he ended up telling the story. There are a lot of these stories, believe it or not. There's a story about treasure hunters going into old mine shafts, finding hieroglyphs on the wall. And this one story that we're going to talk about, there was some treasure hunters who did exactly that. They went into a mine shaft. They found holographic walls in the shaft. They tried to enter behind a wall. Now I want you to think about it. So they walk into this mine, they got their flashlights, they see what they describe as a holographic set of walls that are blocking their view going further down into the mine shaft. So they recognize that whatever this is, it's a hologram. They can see that it is. So one of them sticks his flashlight in his hand. He's got his flashlight in his hand. He sticks his flashlight through the hologram and it goes through. He can't see it on the other side, but he got this distinct feeling something was over there and he was terrified it would grab his flashlight. So he pulls his flashlight quickly back out and he had a feeling, he said, that if he went through that holographic wall, he wouldn't come back out alive. Like he just had that instinctual feeling there was a danger there. So he comes out of there and decides that he's not going back ever. A little while later, a few days later, he's talking to buddies of his and he's telling them this crazy story about how he was down there with another friend and they found this holographic wall and all this. And they say, take us there. And he's like, absolutely not willing to do this at all. Never going back there. It was the worst decision I ever made to go in the first time. So they get a topographical map and they say, well, then show us where this was at. And he agrees to do that. So he shows them and they decide to go out there, just the other guys, not him. He doesn't want any part of it. And they go out, they follow his directions, they follow the topographical map directions as well, get to the spot, they see everything he described as being there, but the hole where the mine was at isn't there. It's just not there at all. There's no entrance marked at all. And so they look all around, they walk around, for quite a while looking for this entrance. They have every marker that he gave them. You're going to look for this, you're going to find that there. There's going to be a set of scrub trees over here. There's going to be this outcropping on this side. Everything's perfect except the mine shaft opening is gone. Completely gone. Now, that's not uncommon. That happens a lot of times. There's another person who had a similar experience in the same area, and when he described it to other people, he said that there was a pile of rocks that made a pyramid outside the opening, and that's what caught his attention in the first place and made him walk over to it. And when he went back to show it to friends, the pyramid of rocks were still there, but the opening was gone.
Makes me wonder if it was actually gone or that well hidden. Yeah.
Could be that they made some sort of a holographic, or some way to evade your senses. That's a very big possibility. In 1966, there was a gentleman by the name of George Wright. He was with a group of spelunkers. For those who don't know, that's people who likes to explore caves. And he was in Blowing Cave, Arkansas. They made their way through the cave. It's got some pretty narrow claustrophobic areas, and they kind of shinnied through them the best they could. And they're exploring, and eventually they're well into the darkness. They can't see anything in front of them. They've lost the light behind them because they've made a couple turns, but they're being very careful. They know what they're doing. They're experienced spelunkers. And so they are marking as they go. Now, suddenly ahead of them, they see a faint glowing light. They approach the area, wondering if maybe there's an opening at the top of the ground where light's leaking in, and that's not what they find. What they find is another very narrow passage through what appears to be solid rock, and they shinny sideways through this to go into what looks like an open, large cavern. And in this cavern, there is a set of stairs, a staircase that goes down into the darkness, and it goes for as far as they can see. They can't tell what it is, how far it goes. So they start down the stairs. There's 3 of them, and they come into an area that's open after going quite a ways. And this area, they estimate it to be like 20 feet by 20 feet with a big open dome at the top, you know. So it's and it's lit, but they can't tell how it's lit. It's bleeding out a faint light, not a bright light, but just a faint light, soft light. And that's where they encounter what they describe as blue-skinned, human-like individuals. The strangers communicated with them and told them that they had instruments that could read people's emotions. They told them to calm down and it was okay. Then they explained to them that the tunnels go under these mountains for miles and miles, and these spelunkers were led downward into what they described as a city. And they said that when they got to the city, the blue people told them that there were serpent-like creatures and large, hairy, bipedal animals that also lived under the ground and in other areas, and that they were antagonistic toward the blueskins. And then they told the spelunkers that they needed to go back to the earth, to the sunlight, and to get out of there. They took them through what they described as a glass-like area of the city. Everything was very see-through, and again, that soft bleeding light. And then took them up the stairs again, out of the cave, and told them to never go back in ever again. So the men were, I can't even imagine if this story is true, and I can't tell you it is, I'm just giving you eyewitness accounts. But to think about what they had to absorb emotionally and mentally to go through this experience. And then several of the spelunkers decided they kind of quit caving at that point, like they're done. But one of them, Mr. Wright, decided he wanted to go back in, and he just wanted to get another look at the stairs and everything. He would go back a few days later after telling his friends that that's what he was going to do, and they counseled him against it. And he disappeared and was never found again. The only reason that they think that he actually went in there is because his vehicle was found near the opening and some of his supplies on the ground near it. But he was never found.
Yeah, what they described it, I mean, that not exactly, but that certainly reminds me of The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
And the underground cities.
It reminded me of the Little Green Children from France.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Yeah. Uh-huh.
You know, that's what I thought of. I wonder if this is like a Keller issue where like the children maybe weren't so much green as like a greenish blue. And, you know, they were talking about living in an area of subdued light and raising their cattle and farming and all of this. And then they wandered up the shaft and out into the sunlight of the outer world, if we will. And of course, the little boy starved to death and died, but the little girl grew up, that she lived and told her story several times throughout her life about where she had come from. And they couldn't find the opening when they went back eventually to see if they could find them again. And the story, of course, from was that these farmers had seen them come out of a cave. They were what they called green, but looked very human in every other respect.
You know you know how it is when you go on YouTube and you just start, you watch one video and then the suggestions
Yes.
are on the side. And I saw one, and I've seen this before, about the deepest hole that's ever been drilled. It's in Russia, and supposedly they put a microphone down it, and it's like 9 miles down or something like that, and
Yeah.
they claimed they heard tortured souls screaming, like it was
Yeah.
they actually drilled a hole into hell. Yeah, and again, that can't be substantiated, but you gotta wonder what's down there. I mean,
You do.
there's so much of the planet that hasn't been explored that we know about. So
Right.
I'm sure that there's been people going into places that they haven't returned. That so we don't hear about them. But
Yeah, and I've often wondered about going into outer space. It seems so, at this point, pointless, because we don't even understand what's in our oceans. We don't know what's under our earth. We don't know any of this stuff. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the story from Russia and other stories,
okay.
similar stories, but I'll go on down through some of the others. So in the 2007, in Staffordshire, England, in a newspaper that was called the Chase Post. It's now no longer exists, but at the time it was a local newspaper. They wrote about a tribe of subterranean creatures that surfaced in the area to hunt for food, and that these beings could be behind a rash of werewolf and Bigfoot sightings near Stafford. The beings were also blamed for a string of pet disappearances. They said that the theories behind these sightings ranged from crazed tramps to aliens to creatures from under the ground. So basically what people claimed that they had seen, that was a werewolf-like or bipedal Bigfoot-like creatures coming out of nowhere, out of the ground, and they were moving fast. They seemed to coincide with the death of some livestock, with some pets being missing, that sort of thing. And it was believed that they had surfaced to hunt. Now, I have to tell you, some of the people who made these accusations were not only just regular civilians, but military. There were police officers, ex-police officers, scout leaders who were leading a troop of the local scout troop into the woods and encountered something along those lines. And there were many other reports logged in the local police where people had called and were really rattled by what they had seen. I cannot imagine a large bipedal or Bigfoot type creature moving out of the earth and coming at you. So most of these creatures, it appears, had come out of an area where there was what was called the old earthworks. It was a local area where they had dug deep down into the earth and left kind of a cavern. And there were deer bones found near the entrance, as though something had devoured the deer and left the carcass, what was left of the carcass lay there. And so people were very leery of it, and this went on for many years. In fact, there are still some rumors and sightings every so often. And it said that, as far-fetched as it may sound, the fact is that there has always been significant mining activity under the Cannock Chase area going back centuries, and these stories go far back into history as well as being modern to this time. So, I don't know if it's true or it's not true, but I think it's an interesting story. And it has been told many times and documented both by local ministers, by the police department, some local newspapers. People have written about it in their journals, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of data, documentation, eyewitness, type documentation, although nothing to prove it one way or the other. So moving on to Tokyo, Japan. Now, Tokyo, Japan has this really interesting history in their underground. So there have been stories from Tokyo for years, mostly from utility workers who go under the city. These stories started in the 1970s, and this first one was about a utility worker who was down there with another fellow. They were doing some work in this one area. They were moving through a tunnel area when the one worker caught his foot in a thick bunch of something, and it was described as like spider webs, but very thick, and it was difficult to get out of. And so the other fella heard him yelling. He couldn't get out, turned around and was shining his light, and they could see what they described as a funnel shaped web, and stuck in the web were the skeletal remains and the desiccated corpses of rats and cockroaches. They described it as several meters square, and it kind of terminated down to about a 10-inch hole at the center of this funnel, if you will. There was no sign of whatever it was that had made it, and people began to think it must have been some sort of giant spider down there, and that it was weaving its web to catch the rats. Now, that is interesting because other people that have worked in the tunnels under Tokyo talk about giant-sized rats, some of them as large as dogs. So obviously, under the city, any city, it's rat infested. It is. And we're used to seeing rats. And now I've seen some fairly large rats. I've seen rats, a foot and a half long, and pretty big, the size of a small cat. But there are people who have worked in the subway system under Tokyo who claim they have seen rats down there as large as medium to large sized dogs.
Yeah. And I don't know if they're indigenous to the area, but the capybara, is a very large rodent. And, maybe you see something like that underground, you may mistake it for a rat, although rats do have the long, bald tails.
Yeah.
So
I'm not sure whether they are in that area or not, but I will tell you that one of the things that people have speculated is that all of the chemicals and all of the poisons from all the stuff that we have put into the environment there might have caused some sort of genetic mutation, and that, that's a possibility. And as there's plenty of food, plenty of time for them to breed, and that they're literally breeding upward, and that's kind of terrifying.
Agreed.
Ugh. I used to, when I was young, we milked, and every morning you would have to go into the barn and get the feed, and the rats knew you were coming to get the feed, so they would gather, and they would literally run all over your feet and up on the ceiling. I hated that. We had to block that off because you would dump feed in and they would drop down into the feed pans, the big feed troughs for the animals, and they would run over your feet when you were milking, and you'd have to kick them away. It was, I can't tell you I was terrified, but it was unpleasant and uncomfortable, particularly in the dark early in the morning.
Yeah, I'm thinking that the ick factor would be pretty high on that.
Yeah, and they were just very unafraid. Like, they were bold as brass. They would come, and you could see their little beady eyes in the darkness when you shined the flashlight around, and you could see they were gathered watching you. So a dog-sized creature that size, doing that would be, that could kill you. I can't imagine. And like I said, there would be like 15, 20 of them, and they were just everywhere, and the animals would stomp at them, and you would kick at them, and they'd scurry away and come back, and we would shoot them, but they literally, that's why bred like rats.
Mm-hmm.
There would always be a healthy supply, whether we liked it or not.
I'm sure you had barn cats too.
Yes, we did. We had several barn cats. We had a dog that liked to kill rats, which was a blessing because, like I said, they were just very vile, and they would get into everything, and they would chew the legs off of chickens, and they were just very cruel creatures. And so we had to wage war on them. So the next story I wanted to tell was of a gentleman named Frank Wiley, and this story came from prior to 2007. Mr. Wiley died in 2007. He was a police officer working in the British police force throughout his life. He existed. He is a real person. This is a story he would tell, and it's quite a bizarre tale. Now, I have to tell you, he didn't tell the story way back in the 60s when it happened. He didn't tell it till right before his death. And some people have said that he took it from a plot from an old sci-fi movie. But he insisted until he died that this is what happened. So he was working as a police officer in the London Underground area in the 1967 to 69. He was given the task of policing 3 different stations down there, ending at the one where you would go out to the London Museum. And in that time frame, the local papers began talking about a vicious series of late night muggings. And that's basically what the local people heard, that there was a vicious series of late night muggings. But Wiley would say they weren't muggings at all. He was the officer in charge of the investigation, and he said, that's not it. We told people that it was vicious mugging so they'd be vigilant, but we didn't want to start a scare. He claimed that 7 people had died during this period of time, and that he had viewed all 7 bodies because he was the officer in charge, and that all 7 bodies had very similar markings. And this is what he described. He said there were a couple of commuters, and the rest of them were hobos and homeless people looking in to get out of the cold on really nasty nights. They would go down into the tunnels, and all the bodies appeared to have been murdered after 10 p.m. and they were all found a significant distance away from the tunnels, like way back into the tunnels. And each body had very similar markings. Their arms and their legs were viciously, that was his word, viciously amputated or possibly even chewed off. Their stomachs were ripped open, their innards were torn out, and their throats were viciously slashed. And he said, we began to believe that it was a man-eater, or worse, a group of man-eaters prowling the underground tube after dark, looking for people to kill. And he said they never found anybody. They never, were able to prove anything. And he said he always personally believed that they were people who had devolved into primitive conditions and a primitive mindset living in the tunnels. Now, I do know there are people all around the world who are very poor and homeless who have taken up residence in these tunnels and abandoned rail tunnels and what have you all around the world. There are documentaries about them, and they have their own culture and their own belief system, and they come out at night and they root in the garbages and they find food and and that sort of thing. So it's not an impossibility that this story is true, and he speculated that was his most rational answer. Other people thought it might be something else, but he definitely insisted 7 bodies were found in that 2-year period, and others not found. People disappeared, but he couldn't pin them to any one series of events. Those 7 all had the same MO, and he believed they were all killed by the same killer or killers, whatever they were. So it was an interesting story. Now, in 1997, there was a photograph that was sent to a local newspaper of some caves in England, and people recognized the caves right away. They said that it was a story about that it was sort of a fake story, but the letter that came with the picture was very long and very full of detail, basically stating that they had wandered into this area and that they had been approached by a group of beings under the ground in this area where these tunnels were, and that these beings had spoken with them. They were human-like in appearance, but again, they were off in the color of their skin, and they insisted that these humans needed to leave their area. It was dangerous for them that far underground. Other creatures would get them. Now, over the course of time, there were 30 reports that were filed of people seeing these things or claiming to have seen these things. It's just an interesting, series of stories. And it would be one thing if it was one guy writing a story. But when you got 30 separate reports over a course of time, then you have to wonder, is there something else going on? It's bizarre. So I'm going to go on to the Cascade Mountains. It's called an area called Skycomish, Washington. And there are some tunnels under there, train tunnels from what was called the Cascade Tunnel, which is part of a train system. And according to people who have wandered through this abandoned area, there have been sightings of a large hulking beast, an animal of some sort, with great shining yellow eyes. People have reported this. Now, this story was researched by a gentleman I would call a friend. I've known him for years, Brad Steiger, in one of his books, Real Monsters, Gruesome Critters, and Beasts from the Dark Side. And he talks about a guy named Dave who was in the tunnel, kind of just exploring, and he had gone in to investigate, take some photographs, and was about 40 feet in when he had seen these glowing eyes, and the creature stepped forward, whatever it was. And the guy said, hey, dude, something with glowing yellow eyes comes stepping out of the darkness at me. I guarantee I'll run fast. I am not that strong. I'm going to barrel butt out of there. But anyway, this Dave guy sees this thing. It steps out in front of him, and he described it as an indistinct, massive, shadowy figure about 9 feet high. And it seemed to shift and waver as it stood there. He was so panicked by whatever it was that he turned and he ran, and he got out of the tunnel, headed for his truck, and he claimed that as he got into the truck, he could hear metallic banging at the tunnel entrance, and he just took off. He was not interested in exploring anymore. But as what happens once you get home and the rationality of daylight hits, you begin to second guess yourself and you start questioning things. And so it happened to Dave that he went back to the site with some friends a few days later, telling them, having told them what he had seen, and they were all kind of laughing and goofing at Dave, until they stepped inside the tunnel and they saw the yellow eyes peering out of the darkness themselves. They barreled out of there again, and that was the end of his story. Now, what it was, I don't know, but I don't know of anything that would be able to be this moving, massive, shifting mass that just kind of wavered with eyes glowing out at about the 9-foot level.
Yeah, what went through my mind is, and you've mentioned it before, hologram. Especially if it's wavering, that would make me think that it's some type of projection, maybe. Yeah, I'm not saying it wasn't a flesh and blood creature, or ectoplasm creature, whatever. But right. That's a possibility.
It is a possibility. Another possibility might be, if you remember us talking about the people who have reported seeing a creature that was almost see-through and looked like a heat wave moving. Yes. And had that it could have been something like that. I don't know what it was. I just know that this man and his friends reported it, and they were pretty agitated when they did. So while I was going through all of this, I came across these other stories that were much more esoteric, and we're going to go into the area where you had mentioned about what happened in the former Soviet Union. So this starts out with a story about the director of the UFO Center in Tashkent, and it's in Uzbekistan, Uzbekistan, Uzbekistan. His name was Sergei Azardov, and he was this happened when it was still part of the Soviet Union. An oil company was prospecting a hole and in the desert, and it took fire. In other words, flames shot up out of the hole when they pulled the equipment up, and they attempted to extinguish the fire, and then a column of fire shot up out of the hole roaring, and it, which makes perfect sense. I've seen things about oil drilling rigs where the gases explode and what have you. So basically that's what it was. And he said it was so hot that of course it kept the people away from it. It burned for quite a while. Suddenly the roar subsided for an instant, and in the quiet moment, military and the oil men that were still close the hole could hear the wails and the screams of those coming from under the surface. Then the people saw a fiery, bearded, and he couldn't describe it as anything else, genie that jumped out from under the surface of the fire. His arms were folded, and the genie could be seen perfectly well on the picture that Uzbek had taken. Excuse me. The geologists heard the people moaning. They all said that they did, and they said, and again, I think the story you're referencing was the Siberian story, that this has happened other places in Siberia. Human groans were heard from deep in a hole drilled in the plateau between the Aral and the Caspian Seas, and was recorded and sent to the Soviet Academy of Sciences for further study. Researchers there did not take this mystical phenomena seriously and refused to research. But I thought this was interesting because the guy was willing to put his name to it. And, I know you're looking at UFOs, but people take that stuff seriously. And I can see somebody in his position saying, I don't really want to be associated with this. And here he is saying, I saw a genie jump out of a burning hole in the ground from a well drilling. So what is it? I don't know. That was his interpretation. Going into that area, there are stories that go all the way back in time to the beginnings of time of what they call masters that live in an underground world. And these stories have persisted literally since the beginning of time. Researcher Nicole Rirek was one of the first to recognize or to organize an expedition into the legendary Shambhala, where supposedly wise teachers were concealed and from under the people's prying eyes, and they lived underneath the Himalayan mountains. According to this story, he successfully conducted an expedition and brought a message from the teachers back to the then Soviet government. It does not say what the message was. It just says that the Soviet government funded this particular expedition. The People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, known as the Bokiy, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, Bokiy, was a Russian commission, and they planned another expedition into the Shambhala. The preparation was controlled by the head of the commissant, and later when he died, the funding stopped, but there are records that they were going on a second expedition, and it was because the first one was successful, existed in the Soviet Union records. During Germany's World War II, the SS soldiers of the Third Reich had ordered expeditions into Shambhala as well. There is a lot of information, if you look into that, about Adolf Hitler wanting information and going on expeditions. There are multiple documentable expeditions by the Third Reich into Tibet, into the Himalayas, into these places, claiming that they had found these places and were getting information from what they called learned masters who lived under the ground. And it's fascinating. I have read several books on this subject. and there there were societies. There were actually a male and a female society that were built in Germany of the SS officers and women who were supporting the whole process. And they were supposedly using these mysterious means taught to them by the masters from under the surface in order to help use their mind power and the Earth's power to help propel the SS forward and to success. And one of the things that happened toward the end of the war is they were broken up and fled in different directions. But there are documents, there are letters from different high-ranking members of the SS troops and Hitler himself discussing all of this. That's why they went to the Antarctic. That's why they were so fascinated with all of this. They believed that there were places that you could enter the Earth and find these learned masters. Now, if that sounds crazy, mark Admiral Byrd up as crazy too. Admiral Byrd was mid 20th century or early 20th century. He was a firm believer and claimed to have entered the Earth and gone over 2,000 miles inside the Earth. He said that there is no North Pole and there is no South Pole, that there is an opening in both places and that you can enter the Earth there, and that he made expeditions to both of those places, and he did. There's no doubting it. His journals were published by his son posthumously, and he talks about all of this. He claimed that he saw beings met beings and made treaties with beings inside the Earth on behalf of the United States of America, both at the Antarctic and at the Arctic. And in the Antarctic, eventually he would claim to have been run out by beings in airships that could maneuver in ways that he had never seen an airplane move before. All of this is documented, whatever you want to say about him. It's documented in his journals, his writings. He wouldn't shut up about it and had an accident, shall we say.
I find that interesting because, I mean, if you take a look at any map or any globe, there's no land in the Arctic. There's ice, but it's water.
Yeah.
So is that not true? Is there actually land there? I mean, if you look at Google Earth, I'm sure it's going to be blurred out. That's interesting that his journal would say that. So, is there something that we don't know? I mean, I don't want to say that there's a flat Earth because obviously there can't be.
He claimed he entered at the Arctic and went approximately a little over 2,000 miles down into the Earth and was being escorted by beings that lived deep in the Earth. And he talked about them, and they educated him, and they agreed to make treaties with the humans about, keep us secret and don't, because humans are annoyingly curious. And you could see why that would be a concern for them if they wanted to stay anonymous. And he wrote in his private journals about all of this stuff. But not only did he talk about it, but some of the people who were with him saw some of this, talked about it. And after the Antarctic thing, where he took ships down there, and crews of the ships talked about seeing these craft coming out of a hole in the Earth, and that these things moved unlike anything you had ever seen. They had the ability to move up, down, around, in ways that a plane could not simply move, and that they ended up aborting the trip in order to keep from having the ship sunk. So he left very quickly. He talks about it. There's actually a speech he gave, and I believe it was in South America, where he talked about the people of the Earth need to stop basically pissing with each other, because there are things out there that are going to destroy us if we keep focusing on our petty differences and not working together to keep to build a defense against them. And it's not just him. There were people who were commanders under him who vouched for all of this. His boss was convinced of what was going on. And interestingly enough, his boss suddenly, after he refused to cover up the information, and he said the people of the United States had a right to know what they were facing. And he thought it was what we would call classically a UFO. That he suddenly had a nervous breakdown, ended up in a hospital run by the military, and committed suicide by jumping out a fifth-story window after he refused to keep his mouth shut. And like as I said, something fairly similar happened, to Admiral Byrd. He died rather suspiciously. Some people argue he was murdered because he had exposed that in the speech and wouldn't deny it when he was asked. And there are some fascinating stories that come out of Antarctica. And I have listened to military officers who have gone anonymously on a particular show, hosted by a very renowned newswoman, and have said that they have had encounters with something that came out of a hole that opened up in the earth in the Antarctic, and that there are places that are no-fly zones in the Antarctic for no good reason. Like there's nothing there. There should be nothing to not see. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And yet, in particular, Linda Moulton Howe is the person, and she did interviews with several military people who were stationed in the Antarctic at various points, and they have told some amazing stories about what happened to them and to other people while they were in the Antarctic, talking about flying over an area that was complete solid ice the day before, and there's this huge hole opened up in that ice, and it was big enough to literally park ships in. And then you fly across it again 6 hours later, and it's solid ice again. Things like that. There's this really interesting story told by a military officer who eventually, after he retired, came out and gave his name and his rank, and he provided his DD-214s and everything to her to prove he was who he was, his orders papers for when he was in the Antarctic, and all of this. And he told a story about being on a crew on an airplane. They were told to take a group of scientists to a specific spot that was in a no-fly zone and park them. They had shelters that they sat down and what have you, and they were to come back in 2 or 3 weeks to check on them. The scientists were to be doing some sort of testing. Nobody knew what it was. They were very close-lipped. Most of them had never been in the Antarctic before, so he and others were concerned about their ability to survive under those harsh conditions with not having any background in it. So what happened is somebody got injured, and in order to save his life, the person's life, they had to, one of their crew got injured about a week after this. These people were set down on the ground, and in order to save this person's life, they had to life flight him to a hospital. And the quickest route would have taken them over the no-fly zone. The pilot made an executive decision to cross that area because it would have cut off a half to 45 minutes of time and possibly save this man's life. When they went across it, they noticed that the place appeared abandoned. There was a huge hole in the ice that they couldn't explain because there was no equipment to dig such a hole, and there was nothing. They attempted radio contact, could not get any radio contact, so they took the man to the hospital, reported what they had seen, and went back across it, defying orders, and then were told, you need to sit down. So they sat down on there, looked around, there was nobody there, nothing, nobody, just the empty structures. And about 4 days later, so remember they were to be there 3 weeks, so we're now about a week and a half into this, halfway through maybe the halfway point or a little more. About 4 days later, the same group of people were given orders to not speak about anything that happened there. Now, another group of pilots and stuff, the crew, were ordered in to pick them up. And they came out, and the description that was given was that they were hollow-eyed, they were rattled, some of them were shaking. One of the female scientists was just softly weeping to herself. They seemed to have had some sort of horrible trauma. They didn't speak. One or two of them just stared straight ahead as though they were comatose. And the crew offered them food. They offered them something hot to drink. They didn't respond. They were put down at the airport. And it would later be that those two crews would bump into each other and realize that they had the two halves of the same story. So the one crew put them down, and originally the second crew picked them up. And they were completely devastated by whatever it is that had happened to them in that week and a half. And again, the huge hole was there, and there was no way to explain how it got there. And then a couple months later, it stopped being a no-fly zone. And so the pilot that was in charge, flew across that area again, and the hole didn't exist. It didn't look as though there had ever been a hole. And he was sure that it was the same spot, based on the coordinates, but also because there was some physical evidence still there. So the buildings were still there, and that were dropped, for them to live in and what have you. So he could use them as landmarks to say what should have been in this distance, and there was nothing there. So what happened to them, we don't know.
And never will.
Oh, absolutely not. There is not a single chance that we will ever get to learn what happened to these people. But I just thought, as I was reading through all of this, well beyond going into the monsters, which we touched on the monsters, but just briefly, there's a possibility of, maybe that's where Bigfoots really do live. Maybe that's where the werewolves and the dogmen and all of that come from. Maybe they are shapeshifters or dimensional or interdimensional or whatever they are. Maybe they come from inside the earth. But there are some very real creepy things going on under our feet, whatever they are.
I'm going to keep my shovels in the shop. Thank you.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I have no great desire to go poking around in caves and stuff like that, because I don't know. I've just always had a natural fear and concern about what's in there. And I don't know if it's just an instinctual, thing that we should be afraid of something like that. I'm not a big person who's afraid of the dark, and it's not like I won't go poking around in old abandoned haunted houses and crap like that. But there's just something about those underground things that make me very nervous.
Well, not the touristy things for me. If I was walking through a field and saw a gaping hole in the ground, I'm not going to go in. Okay.
Yeah.
But if there's somebody there taking admission price and letting you go in, that's different. So like I've been to Mammoth Cave, which is, it's huge,
Right.
Mammoth Cave. And there's all different kind of tours. In fact, well, there was one tour that, because Mrs. Stu is claustrophobic, that we definitely didn't do, but there were places that, for qualified spelunkers where you can go through, places where you'd have to crawl through things that were like a foot high,
Yeah.
places like that. And, for experienced people, like, no, I'll walk through. And, it was kind of interesting too. Every cave tour I've been on like that, they always turn out the lights so that you can see what dark really looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've been through some of those. And I just recently, I found a podcaster who does that kind of stuff. He goes into caves with I guess it's his daughter or his niece or somebody, and another person. And he did Taituna, but he went well back beyond where the normal tours, normally people will go so far and then they stop.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting. I mean, they brought the lights and they showed you what was back in there. And I enjoyed it immensely sitting in my son's living room going, "Oh, Mike, isn't this really cool?" However, had you tried to talk me into going there, he's like, "Let's go there, Mom. We'll check it out." And I'm like, "I don't think so, darling. Not my cup of tea. You and Ben go."
Hmm.
But yeah, and I don't think that they would go very far in because there's just a sense. I don't know if you've ever been in something like that, but when I was a little girl, my dad took me to a cave down in Ganister, which is a rural area where I grew up, and it sits on the side of a hill above um, a mined out area, Ganister Quarry Rock. And there's three old quarries down there, and it sits above the one quarry. And there's a little, maybe 2 or 3 foot long, wide path, and on the other side of that is just a sheer drop, and you walk through there and into this cave. And I made it about 10 feet into the cave and decided that at the age of 10, I wasn't going any further. But my father told me the cave went under the Juniata and came out behind the place where we lived on the other side of the river, because he had grown up in that area. And I don't know if it does. I don't know if it's accessible. I don't want anybody to find out. That's why I don't tell anything specific about where it's at, because I would be very upset if somebody followed my directions and got hurt or killed.
Understood. Yeah.
So, but that is the end of my story. So when you are out there, wonder what's under your feet.
I'll stay in the sunshine. Thank you very much.
I'm good with the sunshine.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Again, unless it's a tourist thing, then that's different.
Well, even in South America, there are some really big caves down in South America where tourists have disappeared from tours, like in the middle of a group of tours. I think it's Washington State, there is a city, underground city, like they rebuilt the city on top of the city. And there's places like that all over the country. And they now do tours and ghost hunts and all kinds of craziness down in there. And I honestly don't think I would be interested in going down there because there's a lot of weird stories from down in there. I'm a sunshine gal. That's all I got to say. So with that, I am done.
Alrighty. I enjoyed those a lot, and I'm going to say thank you and good night.
And good night to you too.